When my husband slid the divorce papers across the kitchen table, his hands were steady, but his eyes couldn't meet mine. The kettle was screaming behind me, that thin, desperate whistle that comes just before the water boils over. I remember thinking I should turn it off. I remember thinking a lot of small, useless things in that moment, like how the morning light hit the edge of the counter, like how the smell of lemon cleaner still lingered from the night before, like how marriage, after 32 years, can end between one breath and the next. "I'm doing this to protect what's mine," he said quietly. What he meant, what I would come to understand much later, was that he was divorcing me to keep $210 million out of my hands. At the time, though, all I heard was the sound of my own heart folding in on itself. We had always been a quiet kind of love. No grand gestures, no screaming matches. We built our life like people who expected it to last, brick by brick, paycheck by paycheck, year by year. Thomas used to say stability was the greatest romance of all. I believed him. I still do in some ways. We met when we were young and tired and trying to become something. I was a junior accountant with ink-stained fingers and a secondhand blazer. He was finishing law school, always hunched over books, always talking about long-term positioning, even back then. We married in a small church with cracked stained glass and borrowed flowers. I remember my mother whispering, "He's a serious man. That's good for you." And it was, for a long time. Our mornings were rituals, coffee brewed strong and black, the newspaper folded just so, his toast slightly burned because he liked it that way, the edges crisp and bitter, mine barely kissed by heat. On Sundays, we walked the neighborhood after dinner, counting porch lights, talking about nothing and everything. We didn't have children, something that used to ache, then softened, then simply became part of our story. Instead, we poured ourselves into work, into community boards, into hosting dinner for friends who brought their noise and laughter and children with them. Thomas built his career slowly at first, then all at once. Mergers, acquisitions, names I never remembered but always heard repeated at charity galas. The money came quietly at first, then louder, then in numbers so large they felt abstract. I kept my job longer than I needed to because I liked earning my own way. I liked knowing I could stand on my own feet, even while standing beside him. We moved into the house on Crestwood Drive 15 years ago. White stone, tall windows, a tree in the front yard that shed leaves like it was always apologizing for the mess. I learned every sound that house made, the click in the hallway floorboard, the way the guest room window rattled when the wind came from the east. That house knew us. It held our arguments, our reconciliations, our quiet evenings, and our long silences. If there were cracks, they were hairline ones, easy to step over. Thomas grew more private as his wealth grew. Meetings I didn't attend, conversations that stopped when I entered the room. His phone face down more often. But I told myself that was success, responsibility, pressure. "You don't need to worry," he used to say, squeezing my shoulder as he passed. "I've got everything handled." I thought that included us. The first real change came a year before the divorce papers. Thomas started traveling less, but somehow being home less too. He would sit at the table with me and still feel far away, like he was already halfway out the door. He stopped asking my opinion on things, small things like which charity to support or whether we should repaint the den. When I noticed, he brushed it off. "You've earned a rest," he said once, smiling without warmth. "Let me carry this part." I didn't know then that this part included my place beside him. The night before he handed me those papers, we ate dinner in near silence, roasted chicken, green beans cooked too long. I remember the way he cut his meat precisely like he was measuring something invisible. Afterward, he stood at the sink, washing his plate, though we had a dishwasher. His shoulders were tight. I almost asked him what was wrong. I almost reached out. Instead, I went to bed early. So when I stood in that kitchen the next morning, divorce papers between us, kettle screaming like it was mourning something too, I wasn't prepared, but I wasn't entirely surprised either. Is there someone else? I asked, because that's the question women are taught to ask first. No, he said quickly, too quickly. This isn't about that. Then what is it about? My voice sounded far away to my own ears. He finally looked at me then. There was something resolved in his expression, something practiced. It's about assets and timing, he said. I laughed, a small, broken sound. You're divorcing me over timing? He didn't smile. I'm doing what I have to do. I signed nothing that day. I turned off the kettle. I sat at the table long after he left, staring at the empty chair across from me, trying to understand how a life can be dismantled with such careful hands. What I didn't know, what he never expected me to discover, was that his careful planning had left one thing undone. And that one thing would change everything. For a long time after Thomas left that morning, I didn't cry. I cleaned the kitchen instead. I wiped the counter twice. I stacked the mail into neat piles. I rinsed a mug that had already been clean. There's something about shock that makes you crave order, like if you line things up just right, the world will snap back into place. By afternoon, the house felt too big for me. Every room echoed. Even the clock in the hallway sounded louder, each tick a reminder that time was still moving, even if I wasn't. I called my sister, Margaret, just to hear a voice that knew mine. "He served me divorce papers," I said when she answered. There was a pause on the other end. I could hear her inhale slowly. "Are you safe?" That question cracked something open in my chest. "Yes," I said. "I'm just confused." "Come stay with me," she said without hesitation, "at least for a few days." But I didn't go, not yet. I wasn't ready to leave the house that still smelled like my life. I wasn't ready to explain to neighbors why his car was gone. I told Margaret I'd call her back, and then I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the closet, at the suits I'd helped him choose, the dresses he once said made me look confident. That evening, Thomas didn't come home. He didn't text. He didn't call. 32 years together, and our marriage ended without a goodbye. The next day, his attorney called. Her name was Elaine Porter. Her voice was smooth, efficient, like someone used to delivering unpleasant news wrapped in polite language. "Mr. Hargreave has filed for dissolution under separate property protection," she said. "We'll be forwarding financial disclosures shortly." "Separate property?" I repeated. "Yes," she said calmly. "Much of Mr. Hargreave's estate predates certain asset commingling periods." Estate. The word landed heavy. I'd known Thomas was wealthy. I hadn't known he'd started thinking of himself as something separate from me. When the documents arrived, they came in a thick envelope, heavier than it had any right to be. I spread them across the dining table, the same table where we'd hosted friends, celebrated promotions, mourned losses. Now it was covered with numbers and legal language that felt intentionally cold. $210 million. Seeing it in print took my breath away. The breakdown was meticulous. Trusts, holdings, shell companies I had never heard of, assets structured long before I ever realized they existed. According to the filings, much of the wealth was protected under a complex network designed to limit marital claims. I wasn't naive. I understood prenuptial agreements. We had one. But this felt different. It felt surgical. He wasn't just leaving me. He was erasing me. When I called him that night, he answered on the third ring. "I read the filings," I said. "I assumed you would," he replied. "You spent years moving things around without telling me." "I spent years protecting what I built. That doesn't mean I didn't care about you." I laughed then, a real laugh this time, sharp and bitter. "You divorced me to keep money." "I divorced you because it became necessary. You'll be comfortable. I'll make sure of that." Comfortable. As if comfort could replace partnership, as if a quiet settlement could undo the way he looked at me across that kitchen table. "What changed?" I asked softly. There was a long silence. I could hear the hum of traffic on his end. Finally, he said, "The stakes." I didn't sleep that night. In the weeks that followed, I learned how quickly a shared life can be divided into columns. Who gets the house? Who gets the art? Which accounts were ours and which were his? Thomas moved into a condominium downtown, minimalist, glass and steel. It suited him. Friends called, awkward and well-meaning. Some chose sides without meaning to. Others avoided the topic entirely, afraid they might say the wrong thing. Invitations slowed, dinner parties stopped. I hired my own attorney, a woman named Ruth Calder with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. She didn't sugarcoat. "He's positioned himself well," she said, flipping through documents. "This will be an uphill fight." "I'm not trying to take everything," I told her. "I just want what's fair." She looked at me carefully. Fair and legal aren't always the same thing. Still, we pressed on. Depositions, requests for disclosure. Thomas remained calm throughout, almost distant. He never raised his voice, never lost composure. It was like watching someone dismantle a building they no longer planned to occupy. And then, one afternoon, everything shifted. I was in Ruth's office when she paused mid-sentence, her brow furrowing as she read through a document that had just come in. "This is interesting," she murmured. "What is it?" I asked. She tapped the page. "A trust amendment from 7 years ago." "So?" "So it references a will." My stomach tightened. "His will?" "Yes," she said slowly, "specifically a clause that appears to supersede certain divorce-related protections." I leaned forward. "What kind of clause?" She hesitated just long enough to make my pulse race. "A survivorship clause tied to marital duration and dissolution circumstances." I stared at her. "In English, Ruth." A small smile tugged at her mouth. "It suggests that if a marriage is dissolved under specific financial avoidance conditions, certain assets may still transfer to the former spouse upon death." I felt dizzy. "Are you saying?" "I'm saying he may have planned for divorce," she said, "but he didn't plan for this." We requested the full will. Thomas resisted, of course, claimed privacy, claimed irrelevance, but the court compelled disclosure. When the document finally arrived, Ruth and I read it together in silence. There it was, buried deep in legal language, written years before, likely during a time when Thomas still believed permanence was possible. A clause triggered by what it termed strategic marital dissolution for asset shielding purposes. If Thomas divorced me explicitly to protect assets exceeding a certain threshold, and if I did not remarry before his death, a significant portion of the estate would revert to me. Not immediately, but eventually. $210 million suddenly felt like a clock. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something quieter, sadder. He had outsmarted himself. When I confronted him, we met in his condo. It smelled like new leather and nothing else. No history, no warmth. "You knew," he said after I explained. Not angry, just tired. "You wrote it," I replied. "I never thought it would matter." He stopped himself. "I didn't think it would matter. It mattered to me, just not the way you thought." For the first time since the divorce began, Thomas looked shaken. And in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about legacy, control, fear. and the truth was finally beginning to surface, whether he liked it or not. After that meeting in Thomas's condo, something between us shifted, not softened, but exposed, like a wall that had been holding back water finally cracking, letting everything seep through. He walked me to the door, hands tucked into his pockets, shoulders slightly hunched. For a man who had spent his life standing tall in boardrooms and courtrooms, he suddenly looked older, smaller. "You don't have to do anything with this," he said quietly. "You could waive it." I turned to face him. The city stretched out behind him through the glass wall, gray, orderly, expensive. "You didn't divorce me to be fair," I said. "Why would I protect you now?" His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. That told me more than any speech could have. In the weeks that followed, the divorce proceedings took on a new tone. Not louder, not more dramatic, just colder. Thomas's legal team became meticulous to the point of obsession. Every word parsed, every email delayed, every request answered with another question. Ruth noticed it too. "He's afraid," she said one afternoon as we sat across from each other, files stacked between us like a paper wall. "He's not afraid of losing money, of losing control of the narrative." That word, narrative, stuck with me. Thomas had always been the storyteller of his own life, the man who rose from nothing, the disciplined builder, the careful planner. The divorce threatened to rewrite that story in ways he couldn't fully manage, and I, somehow, had become an inconvenient footnote he couldn't erase. I didn't tell many people about the will. Not Margaret, not our friends, not even the women from my book club who had quietly taken me out for coffee and asked gentle questions about how I was holding up. This wasn't something to gossip about. It felt too intimate, too heavy. What I did tell people was the truth, just not the whole truth. "That happens sometimes," I said when asked why we were divorcing. "People change," which was true. I changed too. I started walking every morning again, like I used to before Thomas's schedule became the sun around which everything else orbited. I took different routes, paid attention to things I'd been too distracted to notice before. The smell of bread from the corner bakery, the way one house always had wind chimes singing softly in the breeze. I learned the names of my neighbors again. At night, the bed felt enormous, too wide. I slept on one side out of habit, then forced myself to move to the middle to remind myself that I didn't need to shrink anymore. Still, there were moments that caught me off guard, like the time I found his cufflinks in the back of a drawer, the ones engraved with our anniversary date, or when I reached for my phone to tell him something trivial, a headline, a memory, only to remember there was no longer a place for those thoughts to land. The court date loomed closer. Thomas tried once more, a few weeks before the final hearing, to reach a private agreement. We met at a quiet restaurant, the kind with soft lighting and menus without prices. He ordered for himself, then paused, uncertain, before ordering for me the way he used to. I almost smiled. "I'll increase the settlement," he said once the waiter left, "significantly." "In exchange for what?" I asked. "A waiver of any future claims related to the estate, including that clause." There it was. I folded my napkin slowly. "You're asking me to give up something you tried to hide." He sighed, rubbing his temple. "You don't need this hanging over you, waiting for me to die." I met his gaze. "That was your language, Thomas, not mine." For a long moment we sat in silence. I could hear the murmur of other conversations, the clink of cutlery, life going on, indifferent to the careful unraveling of ours. "What are you really afraid of?" I asked finally. He hesitated. Then, in a voice I barely recognized, he said, being remembered as the man who left his wife for money. I felt something in my chest loosen, not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. "You should have thought about that before you did it," I said gently. I declined his offer. The final hearing was quiet. No raised voices, no dramatics, just a judge, a courtroom that smelled faintly of old paper, and two people who no longer belonged to each other. The divorce was granted. Assets were divided as outlined. I walked out of that building legally single for the first time in more than 32 years. Outside, the sky was low and gray. Margaret waited for me on the steps, her coat pulled tight, her eyes searching my face. "Are you okay?" she asked. I nodded. "I will be." And I meant it. What I didn't expect was how quickly the story would leak. Someone, an associate of Thomas's I later learned, mentioned the will clause in a conversation that should have stayed private. That conversation traveled, as conversations do, slipping from one ear to another until it reached people who knew how to listen. Whispers started. At first, they were subtle, a hesitation at a charity event, a question framed too carefully. Then they grew louder. "Did you hear he divorced her to protect his assets?" "I heard there's something in his will." "He tried to outsmart the system and failed." Thomas's reputation, once polished to a shine, began to dull. Not because he was wealthy, not even because he was ruthless, but because he had been seen, clearly, publicly, as disloyal. In our circles, loyalty mattered. Board invitations quietly stopped coming. One nonprofit he chaired announced a leadership refresh. Old colleagues grew distant. Not hostile, just cautious, like people stepping around something fragile they didn't want to be associated with. He called me one evening, his voice tight. "Did you tell anyone?" he asked. "No," I said truthfully. A pause. Then, "They're talking." "I imagine they are," I replied. "This is ruining me," he said. I closed my eyes. "No, Thomas, this is revealing you." He hung up without another word. I didn't feel satisfaction. What I felt was a strange, hollow calm, like watching a storm pass through a town you've already left. Months passed. I sold the house on Crestwood Drive, not because I had to, but because I wanted a space that didn't echo with old versions of myself. I moved into a smaller place near the park, with windows that caught the afternoon sun just right. I bought furniture I liked without asking anyone else's opinion. I volunteered again, traveled, took a class on a whim, learned how to sit alone at a restaurant without filling the silence with a phone. Thomas faded from my daily thoughts, though he never disappeared entirely. 32 years doesn't vanish neatly. It settles into you like sediment. Then, one afternoon, Ruth called. "I wanted you to hear this from me," she said. "Thomas has been diagnosed. It's serious." I sat down slowly. "How serious?" She didn't answer right away. "Serious enough that the clause may come into play sooner than expected." I stared out the window at the trees lining the park, their leaves just beginning to turn. "Thank you for telling me," I said. After we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time, listening to the sounds of my new life, the distant laughter of children, the bark of a dog, the steady rhythm of my own breathing. I wasn't waiting for his death, but I was no longer running from the truth of what he'd done. And that, I realized, was a kind of freedom I hadn't known I was allowed to claim. When news of Thomas's illness became public, it moved faster than I expected. Not in headlines, he was never that kind of man, but in the hushed ways information travels when people think it's their right to know. Boardrooms, private dining rooms, the quiet corners of charity luncheons. By the end of the week, I could feel the shift even without attending a single event. People started calling again. Not the curious ones, not the gossipers, the careful ones. "How are you holding up?" they asked, emphasis placed delicately, like they were handling something fragile. I answered honestly, "I'm steady," because I was. Thomas called 2 weeks later. This time his voice sounded thinner, as if the effort of speaking had cost him something. "Would you come see me?" he asked. The question hung between us, weighted with everything unsaid. For a moment, I considered declining, not out of cruelty, but self-preservation. I had built a quiet equilibrium, and I knew how easily old patterns could disrupt it. "Why?" I asked. "I don't want to have this conversation with anyone else," he said. I agreed to meet him at his condo. He looked different when I arrived, not dramatically so, but enough that my body recognized it before my mind did. His clothes hung looser, his movements were slower, more deliberate. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic now, layered over the leather and glass. We sat across from each other, not touching. "I didn't expect this," he said finally. "No one ever does," I replied. He nodded, eyes fixed on the city outside. "I've been thinking about how things ended." I waited. He continued, "I thought divorcing you would simplify things, reduce risk." "And did it?" I asked. A bitter smile crossed his face. "No." He turned toward me then, and for the first time in a long while, I saw something like regret. Not theatrical, not begging, just tired. "I was afraid," he said quietly, "of losing what I'd built, of being vulnerable." "You were already vulnerable. You just didn't want to admit it." Silence settled between us, not uncomfortable, just honest. "I won't ask you to waive the clause," he said. "I know you won't." I appreciated that he didn't try. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," he added, "not for the money, for the way I treated you, like an obstacle." That landed harder than I expected. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. I left shortly after. As I walked back to my car, I realized something surprising. I wasn't carrying anger with me, just a quiet sadness and a sense of closure I hadn't anticipated. Thomas passed away 6 months later. The call came early in the morning. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone pressed to my ear, listening as a voice delivered news that should have devastated me, but didn't. Not in the way people expect. I cried later, softly, privately, for the man he had been, for the life we'd shared, for the version of us that had believed in forever without conditions. The will was executed as written, the clause held, the estate transferred to me in stages, structured, measured. $210 million, numbers that still felt unreal even as they settled into my reality. The media never got hold of it. Thomas's attorneys were efficient, discreet. The public narrative remained vague, but among those who mattered, the ones who had known us, there was an unspoken understanding. He had tried to outmaneuver his own marriage and failed. I didn't celebrate. I set up trusts, endowments, scholarships. I funded causes we had once supported together, and some he never would have chosen on his own. I ensured that money became something useful, not symbolic. People asked if I felt vindicated. I told them the truth. "No," I said, "I feel finished." In the quiet months that followed, I learned how wealth changes the way people approach you. Invitations returned. New ones arrived. I learned how to recognize the difference between genuine connection and calculated proximity. I chose carefully. I spent more time alone than I ever had before and discovered that solitude, when chosen, is not loneliness, it is space. I planted a small garden on my balcony, tomatoes, herbs. things that required patience and attention, things that responded to care, not control. Sometimes, late in the evening, I would think of Thomas, not with bitterness, but with clarity. He had loved me in the way he knew how, and he had failed me in the ways he couldn't see until it was too late. Both could be true. One afternoon, Margaret came to visit. We sat at the small table by the window, tea steaming between us. "Do you ever wish it ended differently?" she asked. I considered the question carefully. "No," I said finally. "I wish he had trusted love more than fear, but I don't wish my life away." She smiled, reaching for my hand. "You're strong." "I'm honest. There's a difference." As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, I felt something settle inside me, a sense of rightness, not happiness in the loud celebratory sense, but peace, the kind that comes when you stop fighting the story and start living the next chapter. I didn't win. I didn't lose. I learned. Life, after everything went quiet, surprised me more than the chaos ever did. There was no dramatic moment where I felt reborn, no sweeping sense of triumph. Instead, there were mornings when I woke up and had nowhere I had to be, no role I was required to perform. At first, that freedom felt unsettling, like stepping onto a floor you're not sure will hold your weight. I learned to move slowly. I stopped setting alarms unless I needed to. I drank my coffee by the window, watching the park come alive. Joggers with their measured breathing, parents negotiating with toddlers, older couples walking in sync without touching. Ordinary life, persistent and gentle. Money has a way of amplifying silence. When the estate finished transferring, when the lawyers stepped back and the paperwork ended, there was a vacuum where urgency used to live. For decades, my days had been shaped by Thomas's schedules, his ambitions, his concerns. Even my own work had often bent around his orbit. Now, the center was empty. So I began asking myself questions I'd avoided for years. What do I enjoy when no one is watching? What feels meaningful when there's nothing to prove? The answers came quietly. I took long train rides to towns I'd never visited just to walk unfamiliar streets. I sat in museums and lingered in front of paintings that didn't impress me, but made me feel something I couldn't name. I started writing again, letters at first, then pages that no one else would ever read. I wrote about the early days of my marriage, about the nights Thomas and I lay on the floor of our first apartment, eating takeout because we didn't own a table yet, about the way we once laughed easily, without calculation. I also wrote about the day he handed me those papers, about the way betrayal doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it speaks in calm, reasonable tones. The more I wrote, the less heavy the memories became. People often assume that when a woman inherits a great deal of money after loss, her life becomes easier. In some ways it does. In other ways, it becomes more complicated. I had to learn how to say no to friends with ideas, to distant relatives with sudden warmth, to causes that sounded noble but felt hollow. I learned that generosity without intention can be another form of avoidance. So I chose intentionally. I funded a legal aid program for women navigating late-life divorce, quietly, without my name on the building. I supported scholarships for students who reminded me of myself, capable, diligent, invisible to the world's loudest voices. Each decision felt like stitching something back together, not my marriage, but my sense of self. One evening, I attended a small gathering at a friend's home. Someone I barely knew asked, casually, "Do you think you'd ever marry again?" The question didn't offend me, it just surprised me. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't feel unfinished." That answer seemed to puzzle them, but it made perfect sense to me. Love, I realized, is not a requirement for completion. It's an offering, and offerings lose their meaning when they're made out of fear. I did date briefly, coffee conversations, walks, gentle curiosity, but I found that I no longer bent myself to fit someone else's expectations. I no longer mistook consistency for intimacy or stability for safety. If something didn't feel right, I let it go. There was a strength in that simplicity I'd never known before. On the anniversary of Thomas's death, I visited the cemetery alone. I brought no flowers, just myself. I stood quietly, hands folded, and thought about the life we had shared and the one that followed. "I hope you found peace," I said aloud. And then, because honesty had become my habit, I added, "I did." Walking back to my car, I noticed how light the air felt, how my shoulders no longer carried tension by default. Grief had softened into something manageable, something that lived beside gratitude instead of choking it. Later that night, as I prepared dinner, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. Older, calmer, still standing. I thought about how easily my story could have ended differently, how I might have folded myself into bitterness or allowed money to become the measure of my worth. But that wasn't what stayed with me. What stayed with me was this. Betrayal reveals character, but it doesn't have to define destiny. Thomas made his choices out of fear. I made mine out of clarity. That difference shaped everything that came after. As I turned off the lights and settled into bed, the city humming softly outside, I felt something rare and precious settle over me, a sense that nothing was unfinished, nothing unresolved. Just life, continuing, and me finally living it on my own terms. After the first year passed, people stopped asking me how I was doing. Grief has a socially acceptable shelf life, so does scandal. Once enough time passes, the world quietly moves on and you're expected to move with it. In many ways, I had, but there were still moments, small, unexpected ones, when the past tapped me on the shoulder. Like the afternoon I received a letter written in Thomas's handwriting. It arrived without warning, slipped among utility bills and catalogs. The envelope was cream-colored, the address written with that precise slant I knew so well. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined it, if grief had finally begun playing tricks on me. But it was real. Inside was a single page. He had written it shortly after our divorce was finalized, according to the date at the top. It was never mailed, likely placed with his personal papers, meant to be read someday, or maybe never. I sat at the table for a long time before opening it fully. "I don't know if you'll ever read this," it began, "but I need to write it anyway." The letter wasn't an apology, not exactly. It was an explanation, unfinished, imperfect, honest in a way he rarely allowed himself to be when he was alive. He wrote about fear, about growing up with nothing and mistaking security for love, about how wealth became both his armor and his prison, about how divorcing me felt, in his mind, like survival, not cruelty. "I told myself you would understand," he wrote, "that you were strong enough to recover. What I didn't understand was that love is not something you test by taking it away." I folded the letter carefully when I finished. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel relief. I felt recognition. This was the man I had loved, flawed, brilliant, afraid. I placed the letter in a drawer and closed it gently, like one closes a door not to shut something out, but to give it rest. As my life continued to expand in quieter ways, I noticed how differently I moved through the world. I listened more, spoke less, observed the spaces between people, their hesitations, their silences, the stories they weren't telling. Women began to find me, not in crowds, one by one. A friend of a friend, a former colleague, a woman who sat beside me at a lecture and lingered afterward. They told me their stories in lowered voices, about husbands who had rewritten history, about marriages that ended not with explosions, but with legal language and polite smiles. They didn't ask me how to win. They asked me how to survive with dignity. I told them the truth. "You don't rush healing," I said, "and you don't negotiate your self-respect." I didn't become a mentor in any official way. I didn't brand myself as anything. I simply listened. Sometimes that was enough. One afternoon, years after the divorce, I ran into Elaine Porter, the attorney who had first called me on Thomas's behalf. We crossed paths at a conference, both of us surprised into politeness. "You look well," she said, and this time it wasn't a formality. "So do you," I replied. She hesitated, then added, "You know, what happened between you and Thomas changed how some of us think about these cases." "How so?" I asked. She chose her words carefully. "It reminded us that legal strategy doesn't exist in a vacuum. People do." I thanked her, not because she owed me anything, but because growth, wherever it appears, deserves acknowledgement. On quiet evenings, sometimes I revisited old photo albums, not to romanticize the past, but to integrate it. I could see now where I had grown smaller to keep the peace, where I had mistaken endurance for love, where I had trusted silence more than conversation. I didn't blame myself. We all do the best we can with what we understand at the time. The difference is whether we learn when understanding changes. As I aged, I noticed another shift, one I hadn't anticipated. I felt less urgency to explain my choices, less need to justify a life that didn't fit neat expectations. I didn't remarry. I didn't regret that. Companionship came in other forms, friendships deepened by honesty, mornings shared with my sister, evenings spent in conversation that didn't require performance. I learned that intimacy doesn't always wear the shape we expect. Sometimes it looks like peace. On the 10th anniversary of the divorce, I took myself out to dinner, a small restaurant, candlelit, unremarkable, perfect. I ordered a simple meal and a glass of wine. Halfway through, I realized something that made me pause mid-bite. I hadn't thought about the money all evening. Not the amount, not what it symbolized, not what it cost. It had finally become just a tool, not a verdict, not a reward, not a weapon. That felt like a victory of a different kind. When I returned home that night, I stood for a moment by the window looking out at the quiet street below. The world hadn't become fair, it hadn't become gentle, but it had become mine again. I thought about the woman I had been in that kitchen years ago, the kettle screaming, papers spread between us, her life splitting open without her consent. If I could speak to her now, I wouldn't tell her it would all work out. I would tell her something better. You will learn who you are when the story you relied on ends, and you will be enough. I turned off the light and went to bed, not waiting for anything to happen next, because nothing was missing anymore. Time has a way of rearranging memories when you're not paying attention. They stop lining up as sharp scenes and start softening at the edges, like photographs left too long in the sun. What once felt unbearable becomes manageable. What once felt defining becomes contextual. I didn't notice this happening all at once, only in small moments, like realizing I could say Thomas's name without my chest tightening, or that an entire week could pass without thinking of the divorce at all. One autumn morning, years after everything had settled, I was invited to speak at a small private gathering, not as a benefactor, not as a widow, but as someone who had lived through something others feared might one day happen to them. I almost declined. Public speaking had never been my ambition, but something in me understood that this wasn't about performance, it was about presence. The room was modest. 20 or so people, mostly women, seated in a loose circle. No stage, no microphone, just folding chairs and coffee growing cold in paper cups. I told them my story simply. Not the numbers, not the headlines, just the quiet details, the morning routines, the way distance can grow inside familiarity, the shock of realizing that the person who once promised to protect you had instead been protecting himself. No one interrupted. Some nodded, a few wiped their eyes discreetly. Afterward, a woman approached me. She couldn't have been more than 50. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "My husband keeps everything separate," she said. "He says it's practical, but lately I feel like I'm living in a life I'm not allowed to touch." I recognized that feeling immediately. "What do you want?" I asked her gently. She looked startled. "I don't know if I'm allowed to want anything." That sentence stayed with me long after I went home. Wanting, real wanting, requires permission we often forget we're allowed to grant ourselves. As the years passed, I became more protective of my time. I no longer filled my calendar to prove usefulness. I left conversations that drained me. I stopped maintaining relationships built on obligation instead of affection. I noticed how often women my age apologized for taking up space, for changing their minds, for no longer tolerating what once felt acceptable. I stopped apologizing. My life wasn't loud, but it was intentional. Mornings spent reading, afternoons walking, evenings shared with a few people who knew me well enough not to ask me to perform a version of myself I had outgrown. Every so often, someone new would learn about my past and say, "I don't know how you survived that." I always answered the same way. I didn't survive it, I integrated it. Because survival implies escape. What I did was different. I let the experience become part of me without letting it harden me. On a quiet spring day, I visited the old neighborhood on Crestwood Drive. I hadn't been back since selling the house. The new owners had painted it a soft gray, replaced the front door, trimmed the tree that once shed its leaves like apologies. I stood across the street, hands in my coat pockets, and felt no pull to cross over. That surprised me. I remembered the woman who once believed that house was proof of a successful life, who believed endurance was synonymous with love, who believed staying quiet was a form of loyalty. I wished her well. Then I turned and walked away. Later that year, I fell ill, not seriously, but enough to slow me down, a reminder that time is not something you negotiate with. As I recovered, I found myself reflecting on what I would want remembered about me when I was gone. Not my marriage, not the money, not even the betrayal. I wanted to be remembered as someone who chose clarity over comfort, truth over appearance, growth over resentment. That felt right. One evening, Margaret and I sat together watching the sun fade from the sky. She leaned her head against my shoulder, a gesture from childhood we'd somehow reclaimed. "Do you ever miss him?" she asked softly. I considered it. "I miss who we were when fear hadn't entered the room, but I don't miss who we became when it did." She nodded, understanding. That distinction mattered. As I grew older, I noticed how little patience I had left for dishonesty, especially my own. If something felt wrong, I addressed it. If someone crossed a boundary, I named it, not with anger, but with clarity. Peace, I learned, isn't passive, it's maintained. On the anniversary of the day Thomas handed me those papers, I woke early and made myself tea. I sat at the table where it had all begun, now in a different home, a different life. I thought about the irony of it all, how he tried to control the future only to lose control of the present, how fear had driven him to protect money at the cost of trust, how the clause he'd written long ago had quietly waited, patient and impartial. And I thought about how none of that defined me anymore. What defined me was what came after. The choices I made when no one was watching, the grace I extended to myself, the life I built not out of reaction, but intention. I finished my tea and rinsed the cup, listening to the simple sound of water against porcelain. Ordinary, steady, mine. If there is one thing I know now, it's this. You can lose a marriage. You can lose a future you thought was guaranteed. You can even lose the person you were certain you'd grow old beside. And still, you can keep yourself. And that, I have learned, is worth more than any fortune carefully guarded by fear. There are seasons in life when nothing dramatic happens, and those are the ones that teach you the most. After everything had settled, after the story had lost its sharp edges and become something people referenced in the past tense, I entered a stretch of time that felt almost invisible. No courtrooms, no phone calls from attorneys, no whispers following me into rooms, just days that began and ended without demanding anything extraordinary from me. At first, I didn't trust that calm. I kept waiting for the next disruption, the next shoe to drop. Trauma has a way of training you to anticipate collapse, even when the ground beneath you is solid. I'd wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, convinced I'd forgotten something important, some document, some responsibility, some hidden consequence. Then I'd remind myself, there is nothing left to defend. That realization was both freeing and unsettling. Without conflict, I had to face myself more directly, not the version shaped by marriage or money or loss, but the quieter one underneath, the woman who had learned to adapt so well that she sometimes forgot what she preferred. So I experimented. I rearranged my mornings. Some days I woke early, others I slept in. I cooked meals that didn't balance anyone else's tastes. I left dishes in the sink overnight just because I could. Small rebellions, gentle freedoms. I noticed how often I'd once deferred without being asked, how easily I'd made myself smaller to keep the peace, not because Thomas demanded it explicitly, but because the dynamic rewarded it. Seeing that clearly didn't make me angry, it made me careful. One afternoon, while sorting through old files I'd brought from the Crestwood house and never fully unpacked, I came across a folder labeled Personal. Inside were old evaluations, certificates, letters of recommendation from early in my career, documents from a time when my ambitions were still visible, still written down. I sat on the floor and read them slowly. "You have strong instincts," one supervisor had written decades ago. "You advocate thoughtfully and with integrity." I smiled at that. I had forgotten how much I liked being described that way. That night, I looked into consulting work, not for the money, but for engagement. I wanted to use my mind again in a way that felt aligned, not supportive or secondary. I took on small projects, chose clients carefully, declined work that felt performative or ethically thin. The work energized me, not because it filled my days, but because it reminded me that I still had something to offer beyond survival. As my confidence returned, so did my voice. At a community meeting one evening, someone dismissed a concern raised by a younger woman, waving it off as emotional. Without thinking, I spoke up. Emotion doesn't disqualify truth. Often it points to it. The room went quiet. Later, the woman thanked me, eyes bright with relief. "I didn't think anyone would back me," she said. I recognize that feeling too. Backing yourself and others becomes easier once you've stopped fearing the consequences of being inconvenient. Every so often, I'd receive updates from the legal aid program I funded, letters from women who had finalized divorces after decades of marriage, some with nothing, some with more than they expected. All of them changed. One letter stayed with me. "I thought starting over meant I'd failed," the woman wrote, "but now I see it means I survived long enough to choose myself." I folded that letter and kept it in my bedside drawer. There were days, of course, when loneliness brushed against me, not the aching kind, but the quiet awareness that there was no one to witness certain moments with me, a particularly beautiful sunset, a line in a book that made me pause, a memory that surfaced without warning. I learned not to panic when that happened. Loneliness, I realized, is not always a problem to be solved. Sometimes it's just a signal, a reminder that connection matters, not a verdict on your life. So I stayed open, not desperate, not guarded, just open. I allowed friendships to deepen without expectation. I accepted invitations without assuming obligation. I let myself enjoy people for who they were, not who they might become to me. One summer evening, at a small dinner hosted by a mutual friend, I met someone new. His name isn't important. What mattered was the way the conversation unfolded, unforced, curious, light. He didn't ask about my past right away. He asked what I liked to do with my time. That felt significant. We spoke again and again. Walks, coffee, shared silences that didn't need filling. He never tried to impress me with credentials or certainty. He listened, he laughed easily, he didn't flinch when I set boundaries or when I named them. When he eventually asked about my marriage, I told him the truth without drama. "That must have been hard," he said simply. "It was," I replied. "And now?" he asked. I considered that question carefully. Now I'm honest with myself. He nodded, like that was enough. We didn't rush anything. There was no urgency, no fear of losing momentum. Whatever it was, or wasn't, unfolded at its own pace. And that, more than anything, felt like growth. One evening, sitting alone again, I thought about the version of love I once believed in, the one built on endurance, loyalty at all costs, and shared history. I understood now that love can be many things, and not all of them require sacrifice to the point of erasure. Love, I had learned, should not feel like a negotiation with your own dignity. As the years continued, my life didn't narrow, it clarified. I had fewer roles, but each one fit better. I had fewer obligations, but deeper commitments. I had fewer fears. Looking back, I no longer saw my divorce as the defining rupture of my life. It was a turning point, yes, but not because of the money or the betrayal or even the clause that changed everything. It mattered because it forced me to stop living on assumptions. Assumptions about permanence, assumptions about security, assumptions about what I was willing to accept. When those fell away, something truer took their place: choice. And choice, I discovered, is a quiet kind of power. One that doesn't announce itself, one that doesn't need witnesses, one that endures. In the end, life did not circle back to where it began. It moved forward, quietly, steadily, into something I could not have imagined when I was younger, or even when I was standing in that kitchen with divorce papers trembling between my fingers. I used to think endings announced themselves, that they arrived with clarity and finality, like a door closing with a decisive click. But the truth is, most endings are subtle. They fade. They loosen their grip slowly, until one day you realize they no longer define the shape of your days. That is how it happened with Thomas. Not all at once, not with anger, just with time. There came a morning when I reached for a memory and found it no longer carried weight. Another when his name surfaced in conversation and passed without leaving a mark. Another when I realized I no longer framed my choices in opposition to him, what he would have wanted, what he would have thought. That was when I knew the story had truly ended. I had not replaced it with a new grand narrative. I didn't feel the need to. Instead, my life became a collection of smaller truths, lived attentively. I learned the exact moment in the afternoon when sunlight warmed my living room floor. I learned which grocery store cashier remembered my name and which bakery burned their bread just enough to make it perfect. I learned that my body needed rest more than achievement, and that my mind thrived on curiosity rather than certainty. These were not dramatic lessons, but they were mine. Occasionally, people still asked about the money, always indirectly, always with a careful tone, as if acknowledging it too directly might reveal something about them. "Doesn't it change how you see things?" someone once asked. I thought about that. "Yes," I said. It shows you what doesn't matter as much as you were taught it did. Money had given me options, but it had not given me identity. If anything, it had stripped certain illusions away. It made it impossible to pretend that comfort alone creates fulfillment or that security guarantees peace. Those things have to be built differently. I noticed as I grew older that I felt less urgency to be understood by everyone. I chose my words carefully, not because I feared misinterpretation, but because I no longer needed validation to confirm my reality. There is a particular freedom that comes when you stop auditioning for your own life. I didn't feel the need to explain why I lived alone or why I traveled when I did, or why I declined invitations that once would have felt obligatory. My reasons belonged to me. That was enough. Sometimes on long walks, I would reflect on the woman I had been in my marriage, the compromises I made without noticing, the silences I mistook for harmony. I didn't judge her harshly. She had loved sincerely. She had believed in partnership. Those are not weaknesses. But I also saw where fear had guided my patience, where I trusted longevity over alignment, where I accepted distance as the cost of stability. Understanding that didn't harden me, it softened me. It made me gentler with others, more perceptive of the quiet ways people disappear inside relationships while still technically remaining. And it made me fiercely protective of my inner life. Love, I learned, is not proven by how much you endure. It is revealed by how safe you feel telling the truth. That lesson stayed with me more than any inheritance. As the years continued, my days filled not with achievements, but with meaning, some of it small, some of it lasting. A woman I'd once advised sent me a photo of herself on the steps of a courthouse, smiling, not because she'd won something, but because she'd reclaimed herself. A scholarship recipient wrote to tell me she'd become the first in her family to graduate. My sister and I planned a trip we'd talked about for decades and never taken. These moments stitched themselves into my sense of purpose, not as repayment for what I'd lost, but as proof that life continues to offer itself again and again in different forms. There were evenings when I sat alone and felt deeply content, not entertained, not distracted, just present. That surprised me the most, because contentment had once felt conditional, something earned through success or security or approval. Now it arrived unannounced, often in the quietest hours. A cup of tea cooling beside me, a book left open on my lap, the knowledge that nothing in my life required explanation. I did not feel unfinished. I did not feel owed. I felt complete in a way that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with honesty. If there was one truth I carried forward, it was this: betrayal can take many forms, but the deepest one is abandoning yourself to keep the peace. I had done that once without realizing it. I would not do it again. Not for love, not for money, not for the illusion of permanence. As I look back now, the story no longer feels like a tragedy. It feels like a reckoning, a moment when illusion gave way to clarity and fear revealed itself for what it was. Thomas chose protection over partnership. I chose truth over comfort. Those choices shaped the rest of our lives in very different ways. I don't hate him for his choice. I understand it too well to hate it. Fear is persuasive. It wears the mask of reason. It convinces intelligent people to trade connection for control. But I am grateful, quietly, deeply grateful, that his fear forced me to confront my own. Because on the other side of that confrontation was a life I might never have claimed otherwise. A life rooted not in what I was promised, but in what I chose. And that, I have learned, is the most enduring inheritance of all. As the years carried on, my life stopped feeling like a response to something that had happened to me and began to feel like something I was actively shaping. That distinction mattered. For a long time after the divorce, every decision I made had been measured against the past, what I'd lost, what I'd escaped, what I'd endured. Even healing can become a kind of tether if you're not careful. You can spend so much time processing what broke you that you forget to live what's left. I noticed the shift one morning when I was standing in line at the post office, listening to a woman complain loudly about her husband, his habits, his silences, his stubborn refusal to change. The woman laughed as she spoke, but there was strain underneath it, the kind that settles in when resignation masquerades as humor. Someone turned to me and said, "Marriage, right?" I smiled politely, but I didn't join in. Not because I felt superior, not because I felt bitter, but because that chapter no longer spoke for me. I walked home afterward thinking about how easily we normalize emotional erosion, how often people stay not because they are loved well, but because leaving feels more frightening than disappearing slowly inside something familiar. I had done that too, until I hadn't. That awareness didn't make me evangelical about independence or quick to advise others. Everyone's thresholds are different. Everyone's story unfolds on its own schedule. But it did make me honest, especially with myself. When something felt misaligned, I paid attention. When something felt nourishing, I leaned in. That practice became my compass. On a quiet afternoon while organizing my bookshelves, I came across a journal I'd kept during the final year of my marriage. I almost put it back without opening it. Some doors don't need reopening. But curiosity won. I read entries written by a woman who sensed something was wrong but couldn't yet name it. Pages filled with rationalizations, with patience stretched thin and called virtue. Notes reminding myself to be understanding, to give it time, to not overreact. I closed the journal gently. I didn't feel embarrassment, I felt compassion. That woman was doing what she thought love required. She just didn't yet know that love should never demand self-erasure as proof of loyalty. I kept the journal, not as a reminder of pain, but as evidence of growth, of how far awareness can travel when you allow it to. As I grew older, people began to treat me differently, not with reverence, but with a kind of careful respect, the kind reserved for women who are no longer easily influenced, no longer seeking permission. I found that amusing. There was a time when I'd worked so hard to be agreeable, to be indispensable, to be quietly supportive. Now, simply being myself seemed to unsettle people who expected something else. I didn't correct them. Letting go of expectations, yours and others, is an underrated skill. One winter evening, I received a call from someone who had known Thomas professionally. We hadn't spoken in years. "I just wanted to say," he began, hesitating, "I misjudged you." I listened. "You were peripheral," he admitted, "supportive, but not central. I see now how wrong that was." I thanked him, though I didn't need the acknowledgement. What mattered wasn't his realization, it was my lack of reaction to it. I no longer needed to be seen accurately by everyone to feel whole. Accuracy had become internal. As seasons passed, my days took on a rhythm that felt earned rather than inherited. I marked time not by anniversaries of loss, but by moments of presence. The year I learned to swim properly, despite never having felt confident in water. The spring I planted flowers that actually survived my inattention. The autumn I traveled alone without feeling conspicuous or incomplete. Each experience reinforced the same quiet truth. Life does not ask you to be fearless, only honest. Fear will always exist. It's what you do in response to it that shapes your story. Thomas responded by tightening his grip. I responded by opening my hands. That difference defined everything. There are still moments, now rare, when I think about the path not taken, the version of my life that might have continued uninterrupted, secure, predictable. I don't romanticize it, I simply acknowledge that it existed. Then I return to the present, to a life that feels lighter because it is truer. If I've learned anything worth carrying forward, it's this. Endings are not failures, they are revelations. They show you what was holding and what was hollow. They strip away the narratives you've inherited and force you to confront the ones you're living. What comes after is not always easier, but it is clearer. And clarity is a gift many people never allow themselves to receive. I don't measure my life by what I endured anymore. I measure it by what I chose once endurance was no longer the requirement. By the boundaries I honored, by the silences I refused to fill with self-betrayal, by the peace I protected when chaos was no longer necessary. There is a quiet dignity in that kind of living. No applause, no witnesses, just integrity. And as I move forward into whatever years remain, I carry with me a deep, settled knowing. I was not ruined by betrayal, I was refined by it. Not because it made me harder, but because it taught me to listen, to myself, to truth, to the quiet warnings I once ignored. That lesson didn't come cheap, but it endures. And so do I. I often think about the house on Crestwood Drive, the one Thomas and I once called ours. The memories linger in the corners, the smell of fresh paint on moving day, the sound of the front door clicking shut as we left for work together, the faint squeak of the stairs that creaked under too much laughter. I don't miss the house itself. I miss the woman I was inside it, the one who believed love was proven by endurance, who believed patience could bridge every divide. But I am not that woman anymore. I stand in my apartment now, sunlight streaming across the floorboards I chose myself, not because they matched his taste, but because they bring me joy. The air smells faintly of coffee and thyme, a combination I discovered through trial and error. I often pause in these small moments and let the world in, the rustle of leaves outside the window, the distant hum of traffic, the soft tapping of keys as I write, uninterrupted, because I am finally writing for me. I have learned that peace is not a gift bestowed by circumstance. It is cultivated quietly, moment by moment. It is choosing honesty over comfort, clarity over fear, presence over distraction. And sometimes it is simply the courage to sit with yourself, to allow yourself to exist fully without apology. Thomas's betrayal, his decision to prioritize wealth over marriage, taught me more than I ever imagined it could. It forced me to confront fear, both his and mine, and to recognize the ways I had compromised myself in the name of love. At the time, it felt like the end of everything I knew. Now I see it as a reckoning, a revelation, and ultimately a beginning I did not know I needed. The will, with its secret clause, was almost ironic in its quiet justice. It did not reward anger or vengeance. It simply acknowledged what was always true. Loyalty, integrity, and the willingness to act from a place of honesty carry their own weight. I did not take the fortune to punish him. I used it to reclaim my life, to help others, and to ensure that wealth became a tool for purpose rather than a measure of power. I think about the women I have met along the way, those who have confided in me, sought my advice, or simply shared a knowing look across a crowded room. Their struggles often echo my own, the feeling of being invisible, the negotiation of self-respect, the quiet endurance of circumstances that demanded too much compromise. In these encounters, I have learned that the deepest connections do not arise from shared victories, but from shared resilience. I also think about love, not the kind that asks you to disappear into someone else's shadow, but the kind that allows you to remain yourself. That kind of love does not demand perfection, nor does it insist on control. It is gentle, patient, and unwavering, not in possession, but in presence. I have learned to recognize it when it arrives in small, quiet ways, a friendship that endures, a laugh that is freely shared, a moment of trust offered without expectation. Sometimes when I sit alone in the evening, I think of Thomas, not with bitterness, not with regret, but with understanding. Fear drove him in ways I could see clearly, and yet in the wake of that fear, I discovered my own courage. I discovered that survival is not enough. What matters is living fully, honestly, and with integrity. The world moves quickly, and people often judge success by what is visible, the house, the title, the wealth, but I measure it differently now. I measure it by clarity, by intention, by the ability to remain unshaken when the storm of expectation, obligation, or betrayal passes through. I measure it by the quiet knowledge that I can wake each morning, breathe freely, and know that the choices I make belong to me and to no one else. I have learned to forgive, not because Thomas deserved it, but because I deserve to release the weight of resentment. Forgiveness does not erase the past. It frees you to move through the present without carrying the burden of someone else's decisions. In forgiving, I reclaimed space in my life that had been occupied by anger, fear, and expectation. That space became mine to fill with growth, joy, and purpose. Looking back now, I see the arc of my story not as a tragedy, but as a testament to resilience. I see the divorce, the betrayal, the secret clause, and the fortune not as endings, but as catalysts. They forced me to examine myself, to confront uncomfortable truths, and to build a life that is authentically mine. The pain was real, the heartbreak deep, and the loss undeniable, but it did not define me. What defines me is the life I have chosen afterward, a life of honesty, reflection, and presence, a life where small pleasures, sunlight through the window, the sound of a friend's laughter, the satisfaction of a well-tended garden hold as much meaning as grand achievements. A life where I measure success not by what I have, but by who I am and how I move through the world. And so the story ends, not with fury, not with revenge, and not with despair. It ends with quiet triumph. Not the loud triumph of headlines, nor the fleeting satisfaction of vindication, but the enduring triumph of a life reclaimed, choices honored, and self-respect restored. The house on Crestwood Drive no longer matters. The money no longer defines me. What remains is the woman who survived, who chose clarity over compromise, truth over fear, and freedom over expectation. That woman is still here, still learning, still growing, and finally, fully alive. In this quiet, reflective place, I have discovered the ultimate truth. Life does not demand that we be perfect, nor that we endure without question. It asks only that we be present, honest, and brave enough to claim ourselves. Everything else, love, loss, betrayal, wealth, and legacy, is the material through which that lesson is revealed. And so I live, freely, intentionally, honestly. Not because life was easy, not because I was spared, but because I chose it to meet it fully, without apology, without fear, and with a heart finally at peace.